I'm Adrian. I've met some of you, but I've met only online. I just want to say thanks for inviting us, thanks for organising it. It's one of the best bits of my job in Sussex here, is interacting with students, with inspired and inspiring students. And to do that in person makes a big difference, and it's been a difficult year for all of us. This is my first lecture face-to-face for 16 months, so I might be a bit rusty, bear with me, but I'm also looking forward to continuing the discussion and the interactions outside afterwards. So yeah, I'm a reader in technology and sustainability here at SPRU. I've been at SPRU for 20 years, which makes me feel very old. And this is the area that I've worked on most, but I've also worked with the STEP Centre in areas around energy and climate change, water and sanitation, and also health. And one of the most recent collaborations I've had with 3 Steps has been very much with Anabel. She and I have been co-leading an international network called the Transformative Knowledge Network for the last 5 years. You can find out lots more about it online, but actually we're both really interested in this field. We've not collaborated directly in this field before, and in fact we've both got lots of really, I would say, interesting ideas bubbling away. This is a great opportunity for us to, for the first time, talk about it together and try and throw these ideas around, perhaps in a bit of a chaotic way, so again, bear with us, but also interact with you guys and hear what you think afterwards. Anabel, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Hi. Well, I'm Anabel, Marin. I work at IDS. I'm the cluster leader of a cluster that's called Market Business in the States. I have just very recently joined. Before I was in Argentina, where I directed a research institution that does research and policy engagement on issues of science and technology policy. I used to be at SPRU. I did my PhD here. This is when I met Adrian. That's long ago. And my work is yes, in this kind of issues, new technologies, but from the perspective of development. Always trying to understand how new technologies and regulations and new markets emerge and impact the possibilities of emerging economies to take the benefits of these technologies for the creation of new business and so on. So this is a very general presentation, and then I work in specific industries also, like agriculture, mining, oil and gas, and so on.
Great, thanks Anabel. So yeah, it's really, I really appreciate Anabel from IDS coming over to join us for this as well. It's fantastic. So what are we going to cover today? Just run through first. This is the SPRU Sustainability Workshops series. Why we're interested in genetic technologies and why agriculture. Just run through that. We'll think about some of the environmental and social dimensions of genetic technologies in agriculture, and in particular, how those can be regulated and how those are regulated differently in different parts of the world. Leading to what's been termed the world's biggest food fight, which I'll just introduce. Before we go on to talk about emerging genetic technologies, some of which you will have heard of, many of which I probably won't have heard of because the field is moving extremely fast. But we're going to be looking at some of the opportunities and particular challenges that those present to regulators. And I'm going to go on and tell you a bit about the situation as I see it from the UK perspective, and Anabel is going to talk about the situation from Argentina. We're going to be going backwards and forwards throughout the talk, and just with different interventions on our areas of expertise. And then at the end, we really want to ask these questions of you guys to start thinking about agricultural biotechnology, different types of agricultural biotechnology. Genetically modified organisms is the main thing that I will be talking about, but also gene-edited plants, and the opportunities and challenges that those pose for different countries around the world. So the key thing we're going to end up with discussing is different framings of sustainability, how these technologies have different implications for environmental and social sustainability in different countries of the world. And so that would be a little group exercise and discussion at the end. Feel free to put your hand up and interrupt at any point with questions. I'll be very happy to take them. So, why genetic technologies and why agriculture? A couple of reasons, really. If you think about genetic technologies as the ways in which humankind can impact on and change genetic resources, that is, organisms, whether those are plants, animals, I think that this is really the basis, the starting point for much that we think of now as human development, and actually what we think of as different types of civilizations. How many people have heard of the Holocene? Okay, so, yes, some people have heard of the Holocene. The Holocene, just very, very briefly, we can describe as the last 10,000 years or so of history on this planet, where various different planetary systems have remained relatively stable. So that's things like levels of biodiversity, things like levels of CO2, various other systems that I'll come on to in the next slide. Over that 10,000 years, one of the key things that happened in different parts of the world is that different plants got domesticated by different societies. So, for example, in Africa, you've got crops like finger millet, which thousands of years ago were domesticated and became staple crops. You've got maize, beans, that 7,500 years ago in South America were domesticated. In the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, you have wheat, about 9,000 years ago. In China, you might be looking at foxtail and broomcorn millet, different types of millet. And then even longer ago in Papua New Guinea, we had taro and yam that were domesticated. And all of these led to settled agriculture, what we call agriculture. So actual cultivation rather than hunting and gathering. And that has provided us with the foundation to develop as societies and as civilizations in a multitude of ways that we have done so. So from that very early stage, humans interacted with genetic resources and humans influenced and changed those genetic resources. That's why you might think of them as technologies. In the last 100 years or so, humans have started to impact on seeds and on genetic resources in much more deliberate ways. Especially when we look at some of the forms of agriculture, industrial agriculture, that we have in this country and other rich countries. We'll be talking a bit about that as we go on. Seeds have changed, especially with industrial agriculture, in ways that has gone alongside other technological changes. For example, use of synthetic inputs, chemical inputs, and also mechanisation. And together, those forms of agriculture have had huge impacts globally on sustainability. So, how many people recognise this diagram? A few people, that's good. We come back to the Holocene. This is a diagram that represents what's known as the planetary boundaries. 2015 paper by Will Stephan and colleagues. This actually shows the levels of disturbance in those planetary systems that I mentioned before. Climate change, biodiversity, that we've seen over the last 10,000 years of the Holocene. And in red, you can see that those systems where we've overshot them and we've gone outside the range that we've seen over the last 10,000 years. These are the points that make us especially worried in terms of sustainability. We say that we've crossed the planetary boundaries and we've gone outside that natural range of change that has been seen during that period within which human societies have developed. And so the big worry is that that puts us at risk in terms of future development and also losing all of the gains that we've got so far. Agriculture is really, really strongly implicated in many of these planetary boundaries. So, agriculture leads to land system change and genetic diversity loss, biodiversity loss. It uses fresh water, precious resource in many parts of the world. it has a big impact on biogeochemical flows, in particular phosphorus and nitrogen, which are the key ingredients in many fertilizers that industrial agriculture strongly relies upon. And it also has climate change impacts as a result, as I said, of mechanisation, but also as a result of fertilisers and other inputs. And that also leads on to ocean acidification. So many of the planetary boundaries are impacted on by agriculture. But importantly, not all agriculture. The kinds of agriculture that we practice largely in this country and what we'll call industrial agriculture, which is practiced across North America and parts of various other regions across the world. The major contribution, especially to the climate change, ocean acidification, biogeochemical flows side of things, is the use of fertilizers. Now, you might think that's got nothing to do with seeds, but actually, over the last 100 years or so, since we worked out how to make nitrogen fertilizers from nitrogen in the air, this is the chemical formula here, the reaction which is really energy intensive, which gives us nitrogen fertilizers. Over the last 100 years since we've discovered that, seeds have actually been developed so that they respond to those fertilizer inputs. So they've been changed in a way that makes them work better with fertilizers, and that's what's given us huge productivity gains in industrial agriculture. That's the global level. At the national level, in the UK, we see a similar picture. So, the area of land, most of it's taken up by agriculture. Water is not a major problem in the UK, so this is the percentage of water abstraction, so taking water out of the ground, that is due to agriculture. That's small in the UK, but in other countries it's a huge thing. We've got those biogeochemical flows that I mentioned, phosphorus and nitrogen, and they lead to pollution of our freshwater courses, rivers and such. We also have greenhouse gases. CO2 emissions from agriculture are relatively small in comparison to other sectors, but other more powerful, more potent greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, agriculture is the main source of those. So in the UK, agriculture matters for sustainability. That's why we're talking about it today. At the very local level, this is a map of the local area. We've got Brighton and Hove here, city of nearly 300,000 people, surrounded by the Brighton Lewis Downs biosphere, a UNESCO recognised biosphere reserve, which includes some agricultural production areas as well.
Would you mind stating this kind of area a little bit just for the microphone?
I'll try my best.
Thank you. Sorry.
I might get overexcited, but I'll try my best. That's my
best.
Okay. So this is not a major agricultural production area that we are surrounded by. However, some of the agriculture here does use those kinds of industrial methods, and so we do see overuse of pesticides in some cases. We also see nitrates cropping up in our drinking water at levels which in some cases are illegal. So there are issues here on the production side. Colleagues from Sussex are looking at this, and some of that is related to seeds. From the demand side, our colleagues at the Brighton and Hove Food Partnership, which is a local kind of civil society organisation, platform in the city, estimate that 26% of the city's ecological footprint actually comes down to food, the food that's consumed here. So in terms of the demand that our city places on the planet, it's really, really significant. So that's why we focus on genetic resources and agriculture in this talk. Long introduction. It's also why I focused on it for the last 21 years of my life in terms of really geeking out and being interested in the major changes that we're seeing at the international level, all the way down to local levels. That was the environmental side. I'm going to hand over to Anabel, who's going to talk about seeds. It's not all about seeds, but it's about seeds and how they fit into a system.
Thank you. Okay, so Yes, going back to the seeds, and what I want to talk to you a little bit is what has been happening at the level of the system of innovation and at the level of the economic forces that have been in parallel with all these changes, because seeds are central for the agricultural system that you have. I mean, the kind of seeds that you have are very important and are determinants of the kind of agriculture that you can practice. And we are now in a situation that most of the seed sector is developing seeds which are serving this industrial agriculture that Adrian was showing that has having this huge impact on the environment. So why we have reached the situation where now we have a whole system of seed innovation with mostly serving this type of agriculture, and by doing that it's also not serving very well other forms of agriculture which work with different practices and have different kinds of impacts on the environment. So what has been happening through all these years and through all this time that Adrian is describing, and particularly over the last 100 years, is that seeds became goods in the sense, in an economic sense, because before they were not considered to be a good in the sense that there were not incentives for companies to invest in the development of seeds because seeds could replicate. And so farmers or users of the seed didn't need to go to the market every year to buy seeds. They could reuse their seeds, and so the whole system was based in exchanges of seeds that were improved in a collective way. And so why this change? First, because of some technological change, and then in parallel because of regulatory changes. So, because honestly, it was obvious that seeds were becoming very important input for agriculture, so there was interest on the side of companies to be able to enter these markets and provide seeds as a good, because there will be huge benefits, and that is it was a good prediction, but that's exactly what happened. So the first thing that happens is hybridization. That's the way you pronounce it. Mm-hmm. So it is for just some crops, not all of the crops. But this was a technological change that meant that the improved characteristics of the seeds that were introduced in these hybrids that were improved with this particular technology, these good characteristics could not be replicated through generations. So that's what it means for farmers, that they have to go every year to the market, or every 2 years to the market, to buy new seeds if they wanted to have these new characteristics that were offered in the seeds, through this innovation. So that was the first change that opened the possibility for farms to capture rents, because they could sell the seeds every year in the market. And the second one was the introduction of some form of property right associated to seeds, because before there wasn't any IP right. So the first was all the regulations that are used now across different countries that are regulated by an international agreement that is called UPOL. And what these regulations allow is that for the developers, that the people that are doing innovation with seeds, which are breeders that can be in public from the private sector, they can claim property for the seeds, and it's a weak form of property right, because they only can claim it for a certain period of time, and they cannot stop farmers to reuse the seeds, or they cannot stop other researchers to use their material for doing further improvements. But all this change in the 80s, when the first time seeds were allowed to be patented. I'm not going to talk a little bit about that afterward, but here the only thing I want to say is that this changed the whole context, because it allowed the farm to really appropriate the seeds with very strong property rights. So they could, when they could start to use patents, the patents allowed to really avoid that farmers would reuse the seeds, because the owner of the patent owns the seed and the derivatives, and also because the patent doesn't allow to it allows to do research with the information that is contained in the seeds, but not to develop and register in seeds. So this really changed the context. So with these changes, what happened then is, in association with these changes, what we saw during the last 30 years, more or less, is a huge concentration in the seed market. So from a situation, these are the most recent, but if you look over the year, the trend is always the same, towards more and more concentration in the seed market. And now, in NIDES, you have 9 firms that explain 13% of the global market. Now we are in a situation where only 4 firms explain more than 60% of the global market. So, it's so strong like that. Just 4 firms explain 60% of the global market, the global seed market. And this is huge. And if you just focus on seeds which have been genetically modified, these 4 firms explain 90% of the market. So the concentration in this market is massive. And when you have just a few firms that are developing, who are capturing most of the markets, they do innovations, just do innovations from which they can capture the range. So it becomes the whole logic of the market changes, because there are much less interest in serving diversity, and agriculture needs diversity. And so we are in a very complicated situation at the moment. And we already, we know from the theory, from the books, that concentration is bad for economic, the economic literature is very clear about that. From the innovation studies, there are some tensions. Some researchers think that some level of concentration is required, but there are lots of things is not very good. But when we move to seeds and agriculture, it's more difficult to sustain the concentration is good. And we already started to see the effects of this trend with a lot of independent seed funds that have disappeared over the 20 or 30 years. The public research institutions, which used to be very important, particularly for attending all those farmers and forms of agriculture that were not attended by the large company, they are losing space, because with the patent system, it's very difficult. Every time they start a research project, they have to check that they think that the materials they are using have not been patented, because if they have been patented, then it's very expensive for them to carry on with the research. So the breeding capacities of farmers, that is something that I haven't talked about, but all these seed regulations also restricted the capacity of farmers to save seeds and to exchange seeds, because it's penalized the activities of farmers. And together with all this, of course, the independence of countries to decide agricultural policies, because these few companies are from a reduced number of countries. And we know that this is very complicated then for a lot of countries that don't have an impact on the headquarters of this company. So also in terms of sustainability, we're also talking about economic sustainability here, together with social and environmental, because they work all together, and it's very clear in this case. We have increased prices, reduction in seed varieties. We are seeing that all over the place. There are no systematic studies, unfortunately, about that. There is full of anecdotal evidence, and the stories of farmers and farmers associations that are all the time not being able to find the seeds that they need. So, I think this is my idea. Yeah.
Thank you. So, obviously, these changes in genetic technologies and seed technologies have led to major environmental and social disruptions. And different governments around the world have attempted to manage these as much as they can using regulation, using biotech regulation, which is the area that I work in, and it's the area that lots of colleagues within SPRU have worked in, probably over the last 40 years or so. Andy Sterling has worked in this area, Eric Millstone, who you may have come across, has worked in this area, Saurabh Arora, Divya Sharma, are all interested in these kinds of dynamics. But it goes way, way further back to the 1980s. is an early paper with one colleague, a former colleague from SPRU, in the journal Nature Biotechnology, and another one of our alumni, Calestis Juma, who sadly passed away quite recently, was one of the foremost writers in this area. He finished his PhD here in 1987, and he published this book called The Gene Hunters in 1989. I'll just quote from that book. The world is on the verge of receiving new life forms that will profoundly and irrevocably change the global economy. The gene hunters, who first cloned the gene in 1973, are now not only modifying existing species, but also creating new plants and animals. Ready or not, for such awesome power, the human race has put itself in a position to govern evolution. And so regulation and governance is this area that we're going to move on to now. This is this here is a product of formal research, looking at policies in a very organised way, the kinds of things that actually influence regulation of biotechnology in Europe actually looked a bit more like this in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. This is a picture of some protesters destroying a trial crop in Norfolk in the UK. This is a herbicide-tolerant, genetically modified crop, and it was around this time, in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, that biotechnology policy in Europe changed hugely. I think it's fair to say that in this country, it's almost, in recent history, a unique story of how civil society and civil disobedience can alter the trajectory of technologies. And actually that pattern has been seen in other countries and to some extent at an international level, which makes it even more interesting. The key story that I looked at in my PhD ages and ages ago, and the one that I'm going to talk about in this slide, is the divergence of regulation between the USA, which was really the lead country, investing in the technologies and also regulating them and then commercializing them, and the European Union. That's what I compared in my PhD. And there is a divergence both on the environmental side that I talked about earlier, but also on the intellectual property side that Anabel talked about. So, Anabel mentioned this. In the USA, we started off with this very important case, Diamond versus Chakrabarty, which paved the way for what is known as patents on life. Patenting of organisms, genetically modified organisms, and even of genetic sequences and various applications that use them. That was from 1980, led to lots of patents in this area in the US, and the coordinated framework, just like this IP decision, was the decision in the US to regulate biosafety implications of GMOs, not on the basis of new laws, so not democratically discussed, debated laws, but actually old laws that had been developed for different technologies, like insecticides or like plant pests, so organisms that are a threat to agriculture. So this is the big story in the US, is that they decided against introducing new laws, and there wasn't a coordinated democratic debate about how to regulate the technology. And as a result, their trajectory went off rapidly in a way that led to the development and commercialization of these products, and also meant that at least some of the biggest firms that Anabel mentioned in her previous slides were resident in the USA. And we saw a very different story in the EU, in the European Union, where both in terms of biosafety and also in terms of, clicking the wrong place. Biosafety, the directive on deliberate release into the environment, and also intellectual property. There were new laws that were put together that were debated within the European Parliament. And so there was big input from civil society and different lobby groups in shaping those. And that led to a series of other regulations and a divergence in a way that these two different trading blocks regulate the technology. And here the technology we're mainly talking about, or I'm mainly talking about, is transgenic, genetically modified organisms, genetically modified crops. The EU decided that it was going to demand labelling for these crops and these foods. That wasn't the decision that was taken in the US, and it caused a huge trade challenge, especially for US exporters. In 1998, the US exported $63 million worth of maize, corn, to the EU, largely for animal food. Just 3 years later, or in 2002, just a few years later, that was down to $12.5 million. So a massive decrease as a result of these different regulatory approaches. And sometime during that period, the US decided to take the European Union to the World Trade Organization, take them to court to try and force them to change their laws, or at least to obtain permission to make that money back, those lost earnings back. That's what that's how the World Trade Organization works. So this was the world's biggest food fight that I mentioned in my opening remarks. I won't go through all of the different stages, but basically the World Trade Organization, in its longest ever ruling in 2008, found that the European Union and some member states of the European Union had failed to actually comply with their obligations under the World Trade Organization rules. That's not the end of the story, but at least that was one of the main key findings that the World Trade Organization found. In the meantime, European Union member states and at least some member states have allowed the import of those products from the USA, even though we really don't grow much of it, much GMOs across Europe at all. And none in this country commercially, some in Spain, but a very, very small amount. That's the big fight between the USA and the EU, but actually this was a global fight, and it played out in very different ways in lots of different countries in the world. Here's a photograph from India, where there was a big campaign against Monsanto's BT cotton, particular GM type of cotton, that was engineered so that it would be resistant to particular insect pests, but also the patents were held by the Monsanto company based in the USA and licensed out to Indian firms. And there are different stories involving civil society actors in different dimensions in different countries in the world. Global North, Global South. That's India, and now Anabel's going to talk a little bit about Argentina again.
More complexity. I will add a little bit more complexity. Now, probably listening to you now, made me think that this is the experience of Argentina, but in fact, it's interesting to look at it as the experience of many developing and emerging economies, which have to decide about these regulations, attending the pressures of the domestic actors, which are normally, there are huge tensions. I mean, just taking the example of Argentina, we have the large agricultural sector, it's an industrial sector, and in a way it's very aligned with the USA in some respect, not all of them. And then you have, of course, farmers, though Argentina is not a country with a law of small and medium-sized farmers. It's a country where most of the people live in cities, and the countryside is mostly used for large-scale agriculture. Still, small and medium-sized farmers are important because they provide all the food that we consume. So you have the kind of interest and pressures of these groups, but then there is a huge thing that is very complicated for emerging economies, which is the pressure that the countries receive from in the form of international treaties, agreements, or most importantly, recently, the free trade agreements that have been used over the last years to impose regulations to these countries, and this is really, really complicated. And it's, what is, I get very upset. Really, is on the top of all these complexities that that these countries have to deal with, and the economic issues and social issues, and with that kind of struggles, then you have these kind of international agreements that are supposed to be signed just to open markets and that all will trade freely. The reality, what they have for emerging economies, and normally the most important part are in positions about these regulations. So these disputes here going on between Europe and USA impact differently, of course, in the countries depending on the structure and the economic structure and the pressures and groups and so on. But at the end of the day, what it means is that less degrees of freedom for deciding policies and difficulties to really design these policies to meeting the objectives, development objectives of the country. So just having said that, then when you look at the systems, for example, in this case, for Argentina, the combination of the seed laws that are the ones that regulate IPR and the biosafety regulations, and most recently I have become very interested in all these issues about testing data, which is even more important at the moment than the patents in terms of restricting the circulation of knowledge that is required for innovation. And all you have a mess normally in these systems. And Argentina, so it has a system that regulates IPR seeds that by import. So we have a kind of very soft IPR system. The patents, like in Europe, can only be applied to processes. So in Argentina, as like most, if not all emerging economies, you cannot patent products, you can only patent processes. So in that respect, they are like kind of following more the European model. But if you go and look at the biosafety regulations, then there, Argentina, for example, is more similar to the USA, follow more the model of the USA. So it's a mix, and it's the result of all these pressures and all these problems that the countries have to really decide about regulations. So at the moment, the system is interesting because the fact that we don't have patents, and I will show you this at the end a little bit more, we have a lot of domestic breeding activity being done by domestic institutions and domestic firms, which are very, very innovative and very successful, and they have been able to emerge because of the very IPR system that we have, very weak IPR system that we have in Argentina. And Argentina was taken to court by Monsanto some years ago because Argentina didn't recognize the patent of the first genetic event introduced in the market by Monsanto, the resistance to pesticides, because it didn't patent it on time, and there was some technical issues, and then Argentina said no, so Monsanto was trying to stop crops here to arrive into Europe, and there was a huge dispute, and Argentina finally won this little battle against Monsanto. But so, with this situation at the moment, we have a huge pressures every time that we are participating in trade agreements about changing these regulations that we have. One of them, for example, is to change the Suprema at the moment in Argentina, because when you have a system that allows patents, but at the same time, the seed law is saying that you cannot, and then you have some complications that I don't want to discuss here because I don't want to go into these details, but there are some tensions, but they are solved because the seed law is above the patent law, for example, in Argentina. And so there are a lot of pressures for this to change, and then to also pressures for reducing the rights of farmers to save seeds and exchange seeds. Now, I just wanted. No, this is just to show you what I was saying before. To what extent, because of these soft IPR regulations, you have a situation where the local public, sorry, this is in Spanish, but this is the private sector, which is domestic, and the public sector explain quite a lot of the breeding activity, and this is a new varieties of seeds registered for being sold. So this is kind of capture where the innovation that reach the market. And this is quite unusual, because this is not what happened. I told you before, there's like 60% of the world market is only for multinationals. So if you look at the situation of countries like Argentina and Brazil, less but similar, you have something similar, sorry. And so that's it. I think because I have a little video that explains the situation of Argentina, 2 or 3 minutes, but I don't know now. I cannot see the. No, I can share it with you and send it to you. I wasn't sure anyway if we have the time, but I will share with you a little video explaining the regulations in the case in Argentina and in English.
So most of what we've been talking about up until now has been about the technologies that have developed in the last 30 or 40 years, genetically modified organisms in which genes are taken from other species and transferred into plants. But there's a range of emerging biotechnologies which work in subtly different ways. In some ways they work in more precise ways, but they also raise new uncertainties. One of them, which I expect you may have heard of, is CRISPR, this technology for which Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier there won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry last year. This is sometimes described as molecular scissors, a way of cutting DNA in a very particular point that allows you to change the DNA, whether it's in plants or other organisms, including humans, either by taking away or adding bits, or indeed, if you use it along with other technologies, you can make GMOs with it as well. So it's quite versatile, and it's just one of the set of technologies that are referred to as gene editing technologies. And as I say, the field is moving extremely fast, and it's actually opening up a lot of new possibilities for editing and engineering plants and other organisms. Question is, what's different this time around for countries like the UK, like Argentina, and indeed everywhere? So, the intellectual property arrangements are uncertain. They're still being fought out in battles in the USA and in many other countries. It's unclear how any claims on the CRISPR technology or indeed other aspects of gene editing and other applications will play out. It seems as if in Europe, whilst you can't patent a seed that has been bred conventionally, if you produce the same kind of variety using CRISPR, using one of these gene editing technology, it seems as if you can patent it, at least for the time being. But interpretations of the law in patenting change and evolve over time. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. Looking at it from the UK perspective and the big food fight, the US-EU food fight that I mentioned before, what we see now is a much more multipolar world, not just with the US dominating and leading, but actually a huge amount of investment going on, in particular in China, but also lots of other countries. So there are more actors with different regulatory and innovation policies and strategies. The controversy that we heard about in the UK and the protests that emerged in the late 1990s in the UK came in the aftermath of the BSE crisis, or the mad cow disease crisis, which happened in the mid-1990s, or really came to a fore in the mid-1990s. And some people claim that it was because of those controversies that some European nations turned their back on these new GMO technologies. It's not as simple as that, but there are important elements there. BSE did play a role. What we've got now is a very different political context, different challenges, not BSE, but obviously COVID-19, and all of the tensions and challenges that's raised in terms of relationships between scientific advice and policy, and relationships between private sector, patented technologies, and actually responding to this global challenge. We also have climate change, which obviously was there back in the 1990s, but is certainly much more at the forefront of political debates in the UK now, and has been seized upon by many in the gene editing sphere as an argument for why we need these new technologies. So they argue that we need to edit crops so that we don't need to use all of the same inputs that I mentioned before, whether those are fertilizers or pesticides, and also so that our crops can be more resilient and adapt to the changing climate. So it really changes the debate. The other thing that has really changed the debate, although no one's really looked at it yet, I've got a master's student who is looking at it in her dissertation. She's not here, unfortunately, but I'm sure she's watching at home, is the difference between the conventional media, which is where these debates and battles played out in the late 90s, and social media, which is where so much of the debate is happening now, online. Really, really different, really, really interesting. We don't know where it's going to lead us. But the question for the UK is, especially after Brexit, which I didn't mention, but any lecturer in the UK now has to mention Brexit, sorry about that. The question is, do we maintain the EU kind of trajectory of regulating GMOs, or do we decide to veer off either towards the US or on our own path? There's also questions about whether the EU will continue going in the same direction or change, but let's focus on the UK now. 5 years ago, we had the Brexit referendum, and I remember I was in Argentina at the time, and I could not believe the result. But what happened, actually even before Brexit, there was a lot of debate, especially within the Conservative Party, about how to change the UK's regulation of GMOs and agricultural biotechnology so that it wasn't the same as the EU. Boris Johnson's first speech as Prime Minister after Brexit included this line: "Let's liberate the UK's extraordinary bioscience sector from anti-GM rules. Let's develop the blight-resistant crops that will feed the world." So he's got a particular perspective, and the ministers for agriculture do as well. Many of the Conservative MPs do, and they were being discussed in select committees in the Commons and the Lords in advance of this, in inquiries that colleagues from SPRU fed into as well. Just this year, in fact, just a few days after we officially left the European Union, DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK, launched this consultation. This is a consultation about the regulation of genetic technologies in England, not the whole of the UK, but specifically in England. And it asked questions, in particular about gene-edited organisms, and in particular about these kinds of gene-edited organisms that, as it describes them, could have been produced by conventional breeding or by natural processes. So these aren't the kinds where you bring genes from other species into the plant. They're more of these gene editing tweaks where you're just changing small parts of the genome. That ran for 3 months, lots of interesting debate. The government, by its own guidelines, therefore should have responded to that consultation by now, but that should have happened last month, and it hasn't responded yet. So we really don't know what's going to happen for certain. Sorry, if you could say that to us.
Expecting the conclusion.
The punchline is not what's going to happen in the UK, but we can talk afterwards. And there have been a whole range of other initiatives to think about these questions. The Regulatory Horizons Council was set up by Theresa May to explore opportunities for the UK to change its regulations once we were free to do so, once we left the European Union. The Task Force for Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform, just a week or two ago, came out with a report which was generally positive towards gene editing, and in fact both of these organisations, both of these groups have been positively disposed towards the introduction of GE, gene edited crops, at least of some kinds, and to varying extents GM as well. Now next week we are due to have the launch of part 2 of the National Food Strategy. This is another first for the UK. We haven't had a National Food Strategy of this kind before, and we will hear next week. There are rumours about what it will be saying about gene editing. But they're only rumours, and so I'm not going to spread them. But we really are a really, really interesting time for this question for the UK. Colleagues within SPRU are studying it, and we're intervening in the policy debates, and we're going to be keeping a close eye on it over the coming days, weeks, and months, because it is going to affect all of us for years to come. That's the UK. I'm going to hand back to Anabel again. Okay. You may talk a little bit further about Argentina.
Okay. Again, so using the example of Argentina to reflect a little bit on the same issues from a point of view of countries which are outside of the traditional disputes and approaches of USA and Europe, or now UK. Different. So, regarding genetic editing in particular, Argentina was very, very fast in terms of designing biosafety regulations, and actually then was followed by most of the South American countries, which have a very similar regulation in Argentina, and so the regulations are such like if the genetic editing is using genes from different species, then it's regulated like genetically modified seeds, and if it's not, it's regulated like conventional food. So it's kind of something in the middle of Europe, but I didn't know that still was here so uncertain, the whole complex. And then we have one institution that is the one in charge of regulating. At the end of the day, so with the kind of space for a decision case by case, it's very important the regulatory body that takes the decision. In Argentina, it's called Marin, and it's the one that analyzes case by case and decides whether or not a new event will be authorized to be used. And this is the CONAGRE has been questioned because in this institution you have companies sitting and you have other stakeholders as well, but at some point there were too much companies, and so there were a lot of discussions in the country, and now it's a little bit more equilibrated, and there are representation of farmers, which are not all of them, particularly those producing food, because in Argentina it's very divided, like for example as well in Brazil, where you have the sector that is producing for exports, and then the sector that is producing for domestic markets with different interests. So, what is also interesting is that this law, so this, if I touch there, okay, no problem. So basically, the other thing that is important to mention is that these regulations are not being discussed in the Congress, but they are all regulations that come from the Ministry of Agriculture. And this is very key, because obviously the Ministry of Agriculture just represents one sector, and these discussions should involve many other actors, and this is becoming obvious because there have been a lot of discussions recently about the possibility of using a genetic event that was developed by using transgenesis by a domestic company. And probably you hear about that this genetic event provides resistance to water stress. So there is a kind of management pride because of this has been developed by Argentinian researchers and so on, but has been authorized now after 14 years of being in evaluation, 14. And so now has been authorized, and it's the aim of the company, and has already some agreements even with food producers is to use it with wheat. So this has caused a lot of tension in the country because a lot of people are saying we don't want to contaminate our wheat with with transgenic events. So this is really a big issue now. But so the fact that the Ministry of Agriculture is in charge of the decisions is really a big issue. In terms of IPR regulations, like with the genetically modified organisms, in the case of Argentina, they can only be patented, the process can be patented. And then, and this is something that relates to what Adrian also mentioned, only process that could not have happened naturally. And so there's where then there is a lot that it has to be analyzed case by case, because this has to be better, it has to be explored and shown, and so it's very complicated. And so what I have been talking to experts and people that have been working on these cases, which are recent, what they're telling me is that there are much less incentives to patent genetic editing events than genetically modified, because it's very difficult to prove. But, and also because apparently it's also very difficult to copy, to do reverse engineering to the processes. So companies, a lot of companies don't bother with patenting and just patent very simple or the less innovative parts of the innovation, so it doesn't get copied, because if they patent, then they have to release information about the process. And so basically what we have is a tension between, and this is not particular of Argentina, this is general, a tension between biosafety regulations and IPR, because for patenting the process you have to show that it's novel. But then because of biosafety regulations, is the other way around, and you have a tension there. Because what you want to show by biosafety regulations is that it could have happened naturally, so you won't introduce stress in the environment and so on. So you have a tension there that at the end of the day, what it means is that, and this is what a lot of people so find interesting in this technology from a socio-economic perspective, is that there are less incentives to use strict forms of IPR. So people see it with positive eyes, in the sense that it might lead to different market configurations relative to the one we have now, as, in association with genetically modified organisms. So what I'm trying to say is that really genetic editing technologies become the rule for doing, not the rule, but they spread more and diffuse more as a way to doing breeding and replace this kind of enthusiasm with genetically modified, the more traditional transgencies. And then there might be opportunities for the market with less entry barriers, if already you have less incentives to patent. But at the same time, there is a lot of uncertainty because of these discussions going on here, because it's not very clear how at the end it's going to be regulated. So companies are really waiting. A lot of, I'm talking about medium-sized companies that are trying to really, are waiting, investing a little bit, but not really deciding to fully commit to the technology, because they don't know how the regulations are going to be. So this clearly shows the importance of regulations for these kind of technologies in terms of how they will shape the market that at the end of the day will end up reinforcing the problems or not, depends. I mean, if you get into, again, new regulations that will reinforce market concentration, then all the problems that you might want to avoid with these biosafety regulations, you might end up having them because you have three companies delivering the technology. And that's the main problem that I see with the discussions in Europe about regulation. So I'm saying that because from the experience with genetically modified innovations, we know that the R&D, but not just, the R&D and the IPR and biosafety regulations are very, very expensive. And so that's why also it's very difficult for new actors to enter with and develop innovations, because you need to do huge investments, and for that you need so that the result of your innovation can be applied to multiple contexts, because if you invest so much, then you want to be able to sell it everywhere. So then, again, you have a tension because agriculture needs diversity. So this is a huge thing that the current system is bringing this problem because of the combination of these. And so the result is just a few companies can really invest and take advantage of this technology that was sold as a big promise in terms of innovation, but then it's very just a few companies can invest and really go through the whole process that needs to be done to then be able to enter the market. What the delivery can really deliver, the technology can really deliver is very limited. That's what we have seen with the genetically modifying the technologies. Very little innovations, very few. And so all the promise really didn't never really show the results. And so with genetic editing is why there is optimism, because there are less investments required in terms of R&D, but also because still, I mean, there is this, because of these processes that would happen naturally, there is this hope that it would have less regulatory barriers. And we already know that there are less incentives to patent. So that's what really some people is trying to argue. And these are just some numbers showing the huge costs of this is in the case, this is a table for genetically modified organisms, and you can see two things here. One, well, the huge costs in general, but also the how much. I mean, one is the share of this column that says registration is capture all these regulatory, biosafety, and so on costs. And so you can see how it increased over the years, started with 13 and then 33. So in this period, and now is probably even more, is something like 11% of the total costs. So it's huge. And so comparing now with genetic editing technologies, these are the predictions in terms of share regarding the whole cost, and the two situations. If genetic editing technologies are regulated as GM or not, there are huge differences in terms of the share in cost that will go to all these biosafety and regulations and so on. So this is where the big tension is, because these regulations, of course, are introduced for protecting the consumers and protecting the environment, in theory. But at the end of the day, these same regulations, what they are doing is introducing a huge entry barrier for a lot of factors. And so at the end of the day, if just a few companies will be able to exploit these technologies because they are the only ones that can afford these costs, that a lot of the time also they receive a lot of support from the governments when they are located in this company. So there is a kind of public-private partnership that make for every other firm and country in the world very difficult to enter once the barriers are ready. We are seeing something very similar at the moment with the vaccines, something that did happen here over the years. We have seen it happen in 1 year with the vaccine. So how you could, I mean, if you look at what happened in 1 year, they have been able to introduce all the barriers that will end up in a situation where only 2 or 3 companies will be the owners of the technology. And not because they are the best, but because they were the first movers, the first patents. That's it. And so this is the big thing. And I just finished with one example of one of the companies that it's an Argentinian company that I have been following for a while. It's a company that is has been very successful and doing just, I say just because, but it's really, really doing it with crossbreeding. It decided like 10 or 20 years ago, decided to just focus on using crossbreeding technologies, of course investing a lot in R&D, but for using for tools that can assist in crossbreeding, biotech tools that make the processes much more efficient and they work much better, but they didn't go for this, trying to identify this kind of rare genetic event. So with this approach, they managed to capture, at the moment, 40% of the Argentinian, of the South American soy market. So I'm saying that because they are really, really important, because When I'm saying 40% of the South American market, I mean Argentina, Brazil, and USA are the world markets. So I'm talking about practically a large portion of the world market. And so this is a medium-sized Argentinian company that really did very well based on a soft system of IPR in Argentina, a lot of investment, and with a strategy of delivering diversity. So it's very interesting. What is interesting is that this company has started to invest in genetic and everything, and they are just in a situation where they are just waiting for what is going to happen here with the regulation. And so this is a typical case that shows the kind of tension that you have with these discussions about regulations, because each genetic editing ends up being regulated as genetically modified, then they will be out of the business. Even though they already have invested a lot, they have partnerships with research institutions here and have some developments on the pipeline, they will not be able to exploit it. Unless, and this happens a lot, that they associate with some large company that at the end of the day will capture all the benefits of their investments, and this is what we have seen all over the place with genetically modified technologies as well. And a lot of innovation going on there, and research institutes, small companies, but they get, these companies then are bought by the large multinationals because they are the only ones that can cope with this huge biosafety regulation. I don't know how we are. Okay.
Great, thanks a lot. So yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily going to summarise, but hopefully we've persuaded you that this story about genetic technologies and agriculture is absolutely massive. It changes the course of human history, and it's continuing. The new technologies raise new questions, and we're not sure how they're going to be regulated. But one thing is for sure, that the arrival of the new technologies poses different challenges